Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going down the rabbit hole. Literally. We're talking about one of the most beloved, most analyzed, and most misunderstood books in the history of literature, Alice in Wonderland. A book that almost every person on Earth has heard of. A book that has been adapted into films, ballets, video games, and even quantum physics papers. And yet, most people know almost nothing about the real story behind it. Who was Lewis Carroll? What was he actually doing when he wrote this tale? What did he hide between the lines? And, perhaps most importantly, who was the real Alice? Today, we're going to answer all of that. And I promise you, by the end of this episode, you will never look at the Mad Hatter the same way again. Let's begin. The story of how Alice in Wonderland came to exist is, in itself, almost as strange as the book. It was July 4th, 1862, a sunny summer afternoon in Oxford, England. A 30-year-old mathematics lecturer named Charles Lutwidge Dodgson climbed into a rowing boat on the River Thames with 3 little girls, the daughters of his colleague, Henry Liddell, the dean of Christ Church College. Their names were Lorena, Alice, and Edith. Alice was 10 years old. As they rowed lazily along the river, the girls asked their companion to tell them a story, and Dodgson, as he often did, began to improvise. He told them the tale of a little girl named Alice, who follows a white rabbit down a hole and enters a world of impossible logic and impossible creatures. Alice Liddell was enchanted. She asked him to write it down, and so he did. Dodgson spent the next 2 years writing and illustrating the story himself. He called it Alice's Adventures Underground, and presented the handmade manuscript to Alice Liddell as a Christmas gift in 1864. It was a personal, intimate gift, 37 pages of careful handwriting with Dodgson's own illustrations. But the story quickly grew beyond a private gift. His friend, novelist Henry Kingsley, happened to read the manuscript while visiting the Liddell household. He was so impressed that he urged Dodgson to publish it. Eventually, the writer George MacDonald read it to his own children, and they loved it too. With encouragement from these friends, Dodgson revised the story, expanded it significantly, and commissioned a professional illustrator, the brilliant John Tenniel, who was then the chief political cartoonist for the satirical magazine Punch. The partnership between Dodgson and Tenniel was notoriously difficult. Tenniel was a professional with strong opinions about his craft, and Dodgson, despite being the author, was incredibly precise and demanding about how his characters should look. Tenniel once complained that Dodgson was the most exasperating man he had ever worked with. But the result was extraordinary. In July 1865, almost exactly 3 years after that rowing trip on the Thames, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was published under the pen name Lewis Carroll. The book became a sensation. It was loved by children and adults alike, by mathematicians and dreamers, by the Queen of England, and by ordinary families reading by candlelight. But why a pen name? Why did Dodgson hide behind Lewis Carroll? That question is more interesting than it might seem. And to answer it, we need to understand who Charles Dodgson actually was. Before we get to the man behind the book, let's address one of the most iconic characters in the story, the Cheshire Cat. That smiling, hovering, impossibly philosophical feline who disappears, leaving only his grin behind. Where did Carroll get this image? The phrase, grinning like a Cheshire cat, was actually a common English idiom long before Carroll wrote his book. It appeared in print as early as 1788 in a slang dictionary. But no one is entirely sure where the expression originated. One popular theory connects it to Cheshire County in northwest England, the county where Carroll spent his early childhood. One local legend says that the cheese produced in Cheshire was sometimes molded in the shape of a grinning cat. As the cheese was eaten from the tail toward the head, the grin would be the last thing to disappear. A grin without a cat, just as Carroll describes. Another theory suggests that the phrase referred to pub signs in Cheshire, which often depicted lions that, to less skilled painters, ended up looking more like grinning cats. Carroll took this familiar idiom and made it literal, philosophical, and haunting. The Cheshire Cat in the book is the only creature in Wonderland who speaks to Alice with genuine clarity. He's the one who tells her, "We're all mad here." He's the one who poses the real philosophical question: does it matter which way you go if you don't know where you want to get to? The Cheshire Cat is the book's philosopher, and like all good philosophy, he's there one moment, gone the next, leaving only questions behind. Now, let's return to the man himself. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson was born on January 27, 1832, in a small village called Daresbury in, yes, Cheshire. He was the eldest son of an Anglican clergyman, Reverend Charles Dodgson Sr., and the third of 11 children. Growing up in a large, boisterous, deeply religious household shaped Dodgson profoundly. His father was an intellectually rigorous man who demanded high standards from his children, but he was also affectionate, and Dodgson adored him. Religion was not merely a profession in the Dodgson household, it was the air they breathed. Every day was structured around prayer, Bible reading, and moral instruction. As a young man, Dodgson followed his father's path. He studied theology alongside mathematics at Christ Church College, Oxford, was ordained as a deacon in the Church of England in 1861, and took up his duties as a lay minister. But here's where it gets complicated. Dodgson was ordained as a deacon, but he never became a full priest. He preached very rarely and with great anxiety. He suffered from a pronounced stammer, a stutter that had plagued him since childhood and made public speaking genuinely painful. Some scholars believe this stammer had a profound influence on his writing. In Wonderland, language is constantly slipping, twisting, and misbehaving. Words mean what the speaker wants them to mean. Communication is perpetually on the verge of breaking down. Was Carroll, on some level, writing about his own complicated relationship with spoken language? It's a question worth sitting with. While Lewis Carroll belonged to the world, Charles Dodgson belonged to Oxford, specifically to Christ Church College, where he spent virtually his entire adult life. He arrived as an undergraduate in 1851 and essentially never left. After graduating with first-class honors in mathematics, he was appointed as a mathematical lecturer at Christ Church, a position he held for the next 26 years. Dodgson was a serious mathematician, not a revolutionary one. He didn't produce theorems that shook the foundations of the discipline, but a careful, precise, and deeply passionate one. He published several legitimate mathematical works under his real name, including works on Euclidean geometry, algebraic theory, and, most entertainingly, a mathematical analysis of parliamentary voting systems that was genuinely ahead of its time. This mathematical mind is everywhere in Alice in Wonderland, though Carroll hides it with such artistry that most readers never notice. Take the famous scene where Alice tries to do arithmetic in Wonderland. Let me see, 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear, I shall never get to 20 at that rate. This is not nonsense. Dodgson is doing real mathematics here. He's using different number bases, systems where the multiplication tables work out exactly as Alice describes. The joke is mathematically precise, hidden inside what sounds like a child's confused rambling. Carroll does this repeatedly throughout the book, wrapping genuine logical and mathematical puzzles inside apparent absurdity. It was his signature trick, and it delighted the mathematicians of his era even as it charmed everyone else. Dodson's relationship with Christ Church was the central relationship of his adult life. He lived in rooms at the college for decades. He ate in its dining hall, prayed in its cathedral, walked in its gardens. The college was his world. But it was not always a comfortable world. The Victorian university system was rigid, hierarchical, and deeply political. Christ Church was one of Oxford's most prestigious colleges, and prestige, as always, attracted ambition and intrigue. Dodgson documented the political battles of college life in one of his most delightful works, a pamphlet called The New Belfry of Christ Church, published in 1872. It was a scathing satirical attack on a proposed new bell tower that Dodgson considered an architectural abomination. The pamphlet was anonymous, but everyone in Oxford knew immediately who had written it. It's brilliant, savage, and very funny, and it tells you a great deal about Dodson's character. He was not, despite his mild outward manner, a pushover. He was someone with strong aesthetic opinions and a sharp tongue, who chose to deploy his wit in writing rather than confrontation. His relationships with his colleagues were complex. Some admired him enormously. Others found him eccentric, precious, or difficult. He had a gift for friendship, but also a talent for maintaining precise, sometimes unusual social boundaries. He never married. He was appointed to a senior studentship at Christ Church, a fellowship that, under the rules of the time, required its holder to remain celibate and to take holy orders. These were rules that shaped the entire structure of his personal life. One of the great surprises for anyone who digs into Lewis Carroll's life is how much he loved the theater. In Victorian England, the theater occupied a peculiar moral position. The church regarded it with suspicion. Actors were considered low class. Theatrical performances could be morally questionable, and respectable clergymen were generally expected to keep their distance. Dodgson ignored this entirely. He was an enthusiastic, almost obsessive theater-goer. He attended productions in London and Oxford with great frequency. He followed the careers of actresses with real interest. He knew the theatrical world of his era intimately. His particular passion was for the work of Henry Irving, the greatest actor of the Victorian age. Dodgson saw Irving perform multiple times and wrote about him with genuine admiration. He also loved comedies, farces, operettas, the comic operas of Gilbert and Sullivan. Some scholars have suggested that Dodgson's love of theater fed directly into Alice in Wonderland. The book is, in a sense, a series of theatrical scenes. Each chapter presents a new set, new characters, a new piece of dramatic action. The Queen of Hearts with her court, the Mad Hatter's tea party, the caucus race. These are vignettes, sketches, almost performance pieces. The book's dialogue, too, has a theatrical quality. Characters don't simply talk, they perform. Every conversation in Wonderland is a kind of debate, a game of verbal combat, a scene. Carroll's theatrical sensibility gave Alice its pace, its vividness, its sense of drama hidden inside absurdity. Here we arrive at one of the most discussed and most misunderstood aspects of Carroll's life. Charles Dodgson was one of the early pioneers of photography. He took up the art in 1856 when the medium was still in its infancy and became genuinely accomplished. His portraits of famous Victorians, the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, the painter John Millais, the scientist Michael Faraday, are recognized today as remarkable work. He also photographed children. In Victorian England, this was not unusual. Child subjects were common in studio portraiture of the era. Dodgson photographed many children, including the Liddell sisters, in various poses and costumes, sometimes in theatrical or fancy dress settings. Some of these photographs, viewed through modern eyes, feel uncomfortable. There are images of children in states of partial undress that would raise serious concerns today. This has generated enormous debate among Carroll scholars. Some argue that Dodgson was entirely a product of his time, that Victorian notions of childhood innocence were different from ours, that the aestheticization of children in art and photography was widespread and socially accepted, and that there is no evidence of inappropriate behavior on Dodgson's part. Others argue that the sheer volume of his preoccupation with photographing children, combined with other aspects of his biography, warrants more critical examination. The truth is that we cannot know, with certainty, what was in Dodgson's mind. What we can say is that his life was structured around strict moral codes, his religious beliefs, his celibacy, his carefully maintained social proprieties, and that he lived in a world where the boundaries we now regard as fundamental simply didn't exist in the same form. This is one of the genuine mysteries of Lewis Carroll's biography, and it's one that honest scholarship cannot simply set aside. Alice in Wonderland is, among many other things, a document of the Victorian era. It's soaked in the anxieties, obsessions, and peculiarities of the 1860s, if you know where to look. Victorian England was a world of rigid social hierarchy, elaborate rules of conduct, and absolute certainty, or at least absolute performance of certainty about the proper order of things. Class mattered enormously. Manners mattered enormously. Knowing your place mattered enormously. Wonderland is that world turned upside down. Alice enters a society where no one knows their place, where the rules change constantly, where the powerful are arbitrary and the powerless are helpless, where the Queen of Hearts, an obvious caricature of royal authority, screams, "Off with their heads!" at the slightest provocation, and nothing is ever actually punished. Victorian children were expected to be seen and not heard. They were expected to be polite, obedient, deferential to adults. In Alice in Wonderland, Alice tries very hard to follow these rules and finds consistently that they don't work in Wonderland. Every attempt at proper Victorian behavior leads to chaos. The book is, at one level, a kind of comic therapy for the frustrations of Victorian childhood, and perhaps for the frustrations of Victorian life more generally. In Wonderland, the adults are the absurd ones. The rules are revealed as arbitrary. The powerful are ridiculous. This subversive undercurrent was part of what made the book so liberating to its original readers. There's a curious historical fact hiding inside the Mad Hatter's tea party. In the scene, the Hatter's watch has stopped at 6 o'clock. It's always tea time. Time itself has frozen, broken, stuck in an endless, repetitive loop. In 1865, when the book was published, Britain was in the middle of a dramatic transformation in its relationship with time. Before the railways, every town in England kept its own local time, based on the position of the sun. Bristol time was 10 minutes behind London time. Oxford time was 5 minutes behind. This was perfectly functional in a world where people rarely traveled faster than a horse could carry them. But railways required coordination. Train schedules couldn't work if every station was operating on different time. And so, through the 1840s and 1850s, the railway companies began to impose railway time, which was essentially Greenwich Mean Time, on the entire country. This was a social revolution. For the first time in history, a single unified time was imposed across the whole of England, regardless of local solar reality. The abstract, standardized clock replaced the organic, astronomical one. Carroll was acutely aware of this. The Mad Hatter's broken clock, the tyranny of tea time, can be read as a satirical comment on this imposition of standardized, mechanical time on the living, breathing irregularity of human life. In the chapter called The Pool of Tears, Alice and a collection of wet animals try to get dry by running a caucus race, a race with no clear start, no clear finish, and everyone wins prizes. Among these animals is the dodo. The dodo is a self-portrait. Charles Dodgson had a pronounced stutter, and when he introduced himself, he sometimes found it difficult to get past the first syllable of his own name. Dodo Dodgson, he might have said. The dodo was his joke about himself. The dodo also carries another meaning. It's an extinct bird, gone forever. Was Carroll making a comment about something in his own life that felt lost, or about the loss of childhood itself? Perhaps. Carroll was the kind of writer who worked on many levels at once. One of the most striking aspects of Alice in Wonderland is the way it portrays the relationship between people, animals, and children. In Wonderland, animals are people. They have opinions, emotions, status, anxieties. The mouse has feelings that are hurt when Alice talks about her cat. The pigeon is a mother who takes her responsibilities seriously. The caterpillar is an intellectual who is genuinely contemptuous of Alice's confusion. Carroll's Wonderland insists, quietly but persistently, on the inner lives of animals. This was not a purely literary choice. Carroll was, throughout his life, a passionate opponent of vivisection, the practice, widespread in Victorian science, of experimenting on live animals. He wrote pamphlets against it. He signed petitions. He argued about it with colleagues. In giving animals such vivid, dignified, complex personalities in Alice, he was making a moral argument. You can't read the book and think of animals as mere objects. They have voices. They have feelings. They matter. Who was the Mad Hatter? The most popular theory points to a real Oxford furniture dealer named Theophilus Carter, who was known throughout the city for always wearing a top hat, even indoors, and for his eccentric pronouncements about domestic life and furniture. Carter reportedly had a strong interest in the problem of waking people up at the right time. He invented, or claimed to have invented, an alarm clock bed that would tilt at a preset hour and tip the sleeper onto the floor. This obsession with time, combined with the top hat and the eccentricity, makes Carter a compelling candidate for the Hatter's inspiration. But there's a broader cultural context too. The phrase "mad as a hatter" was a real Victorian idiom. and it referred to a real occupational hazard. Hat makers in the 19th century used mercury in the process of curing felt for hats. Prolonged exposure to mercury vapor caused neurological damage, trembling, mood swings, cognitive decline. Hatters really did go mad as a professional risk. Carroll was almost certainly aware of this. The Mad Hatter's wild, disconnected manner of speech, his inability to stay on topic, his sudden shifts of emotion, these could be read as a portrait of mercury poisoning, rendered comic. The Mad Tea Party is one of the most analyzed scenes in the book. A table set for many but attended by few. Tea that is never quite drunk. Conversation that goes nowhere. The clock stopped. The jam offered perpetually, yesterday and tomorrow, but never today. Carroll himself lived a life of almost clockwork regularity. He rose at the same hour. He took his meals at the same time. He walked the same routes. He wrote in the same chair, at the same desk, in the same rooms at Christchurch for decades. His diary records, in extraordinary detail, the precise daily rhythms of his existence. There's something both reassuring and melancholy about this regularity, the sense of a life beautifully organized, but also, perhaps, slightly frozen. The Mad Tea Party may be Carroll's comic meditation on this, the absurdity of scheduling, of ritual, of time that marches on whether anything meaningful happens or not. Alice in Wonderland is full of riddles. Some have answers. Some, famously, do not. The most famous is the Hatter's Riddle. Why is a raven like a writing desk? When the book was first published, this riddle had no answer. Carroll later admitted this. He had intended it to be unanswerable, a riddle that goes nowhere, a joke about the nature of riddles themselves. But readers were so insistent on an answer that Carroll eventually provided one in a later edition. Because it can produce a few notes, though they are very flat, and it is never put with the wrong end in front. Note that Carroll spelled never as never, raven backwards. A typically Carrollian response, an answer that is also a joke. Other riddles in the book are more mathematically precise. The riddle of the mock turtle. What is the use of repeating all that stuff if you don't explain it as you go on? Is a parody of the way mathematics was actually taught at Oxford at the time, by rote repetition without understanding. And then there are the wordplay puzzles, the croquet game played with flamingos as mallets and hedgehogs as balls. On the surface, it's pure absurdity, but it's also a precise inversion, living creatures used as tools, biology pressed into the service of geometry. The game is impossible not because the rules are wrong, but because the materials refuse to cooperate. The hedgehogs walk away. The flamingos twist their necks to look at Alice with puzzled expressions. This is Carroll's fundamental philosophical joke, logic applied to a world that won't stay still. Despite the image of Dodgson as a solitary Oxford academic, he was in many ways a deeply devoted family man, in the sense of his family of origin. After his father's death in 1868, Dodgson took on significant financial responsibility for his siblings. He had 6 sisters and 3 brothers, and as the eldest son, the expectation was clear. He purchased a house in Guildford in Surrey, which became the family home for his sisters. He paid for this himself, on an academic salary, a considerable sacrifice. He visited regularly, maintaining close and warm relationships with his siblings throughout his life. This practical, responsible, generous side of Dodgson is often overlooked in the mythology that surrounds Lewis Carroll. He was not merely a dreamer. He was someone who took care of people. In Through the Looking Glass, the 1871 sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Carroll gave the world 2 of its most enduring images, the Jabberwocky and Humpty Dumpty. The Jabberwocky poem is a masterpiece of invented language. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." It sounds like nonsense, but it has grammar, rhythm, structure. It tells a coherent story. A hero goes on a quest, slays a monster, returns victorious, in language that is almost, but not quite, meaningful. Linguists have spent decades analyzing the poem. The invented words, slithy, mimsy, vorpal, frabjous, have a quality Carroll himself described. They are portmanteau words, blends of 2 words that carry both meanings simultaneously. Slithy, he explained, combines live and slimy. Mimsy combines miserable and flimsy. This idea of the portmanteau word, a word that holds two contradictory meanings at once, has become one of Carroll's lasting contributions to linguistics. Humpty Dumpty, meanwhile, is perhaps the book's most provocative character. He argues, with complete confidence, that words mean whatever he decides they mean. When I use a word, he tells Alice, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. This has been cited by philosophers, linguists, and legal scholars as a crystalline expression of a genuine philosophical problem, the relationship between words and meaning. Who controls language, the speaker or the listener, the writer or the reader? Carroll raised this question in 1871. We're still arguing about it. Carroll's connection to Russia is one of the stranger footnotes in his biography. In 1867, 3 years before the publication of Through the Looking Glass, Dodgson took one of his very few significant trips abroad. He traveled to Russia with his friend, the theologian Henry Liddell, on a journey related to discussions between the Anglican and Russian Orthodox churches. It was the only time Dodgson ever left Britain. He kept a careful diary of the journey. Russia fascinated and unsettled him in equal measure. He noted the differences in Orthodox worship, the strange beauty of the churches, the alien quality of the Cyrillic alphabet, the contrast between the grandeur of St. Petersburg and the poverty visible in the streets. He also observed the Russian love of chess, a game that features prominently in Through the Looking Glass, which is structured entirely as a chess game. Did Russia inspire this? It's not impossible. There's something poignant about Dodgson in Russia, this deeply English, deeply Oxford man, with his stammer and his mathematics and his precise routines, suddenly in the middle of the vast, incomprehensible Russian Empire, trying to make sense of it. There's a wonderful, almost completely overlooked moment in Alice in Wonderland, where Alice, falling down the rabbit hole, wonders whether she will fall all the way through the earth and come out on the other side. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downward. The Antipodes, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word. But I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. The Antipodes, the people on the other side of the world, walking upside down, or rather, walking with their feet toward yours through the center of the earth. This is Carroll the mathematician. He was genuinely fascinated by questions of orientation, symmetry, and inversion. The whole structure of Through the Looking Glass, the mirror world where everything is reversed, is an extension of this fascination. But there's also something philosophically rich here. The Antipodeans are normal from their own perspective. They're not upside down, we're upside down from where they're standing. Perspective determines everything. There is no absolute right way up. This is one of Carroll's most consistent themes, the relativity of position, of perspective, of meaning. Alice, as an image, has inspired musicians across every genre and every era. There's Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit, the iconic 1967 psychedelic rock song that mapped Wonderland onto the drug experience. Alice's size changes becoming metaphors for the altered states of the counterculture. One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small. The song made Alice permanently associated with psychedelia in the American cultural imagination. Tom Waits wrote a whole album called Alice for a theatrical production by Robert Wilson. It's melancholy, strange, beautiful. An adult Alice, looking back at childhood from the far side of time. And Vysotsky, as we've discussed, used Alice as a Soviet mirror. What all these songs share is the use of Alice as an image of displacement, someone who doesn't belong, who is searching for the rules of a world that refuses to explain itself. Alice resonates because, on some level, most of us feel like that most of the time. In 2013, a team of physicists published a paper in the Journal of Physics with a remarkable title, Quantum Cheshire Cat. The paper described a phenomenon in quantum mechanics where a particle could, in a very specific experimental sense, be separated from one of its properties, much as the Cheshire Cat is separated from its grin. In the experiment, a neutron could be in one part of a device while its magnetic moment, its spin, one of its defining properties, appeared to be in a completely different part. The particle and its property were in different places at the same time. The physicist chose Carroll's image deliberately. The Cheshire Cat's grin, floating in the air after the cat has vanished, is a perfect metaphor for the quantum weirdness of a property existing independently of the particle it belongs to. Carroll couldn't have known this. He was writing nonsense, brilliant, logical nonsense, more than half a century before quantum mechanics existed. And yet, his image captured something real about the nature of the physical world. This is one of the most remarkable things about Alice in Wonderland. It anticipated, in literary form, some of the strangest discoveries of modern physics. Carroll's intuition about the unreliability of logic, the slipperiness of identity, the impossibility of fixing position and property simultaneously, these turn out to be, in a very precise sense, correct.
Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson, died on January 14, 1898, at the age of 65. He died at his sister's house in Guildford, where he had traveled to spend Christmas with his family. The cause of death was pneumonia following a severe attack of influenza. Pneumonia was a common and often fatal illness in the 19th century. Antibiotics were still decades away. A respiratory infection that today would be treated with a course of pills could, in 1898, simply overwhelm the body. He had been in declining health for some time. He suffered from various ailments in his last years, including persistent migraines. He called them bilious headaches that sometimes incapacitated him for days. He died quietly, at home, surrounded by his sisters. For a man who had spent his adult life in the bachelor rooms of an Oxford college, there's something fitting about the fact that he died in a family home, cared for by the sisters he had loved and supported throughout his life. His final words, according to those present, were simply, "Take away those pillows. I shall need them no more." He was buried in Guildford. His grave is still there, still visited by readers from all over the world. Alice Pleasance Liddell, born May 4, 1852. The second daughter of Henry Liddell and Lorena Hannah Liddell. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable child, clever, spirited, with dark hair and a direct, confident manner. She was the kind of child who asked questions. Dodgson adored her. It was Alice who insisted that he write down the story. It was Alice who preserved the handwritten manuscript all her life. It was Alice who, decades later, acknowledged publicly that she was the inspiration for the book's heroine. But the story of the real Alice and Lewis Carroll is complicated. In 1863, something happened that caused a sudden and complete break between Dodgson and the Liddell family. A crucial section of Dodgson's diary, the entries covering the weeks around June 1863, was cut out, apparently by a family member after his death. We do not know what those pages said. What we know is that after whatever happened in June 1863, Dodgson's relationship with the Liddell family was never the same. He continued to have some contact with Alice in later years, but the intimacy was gone. Scholars have speculated endlessly about what might have caused this rupture. Some believe Dodgson may have asked, or indicated an intention to ask, for Alice's hand in marriage, shockingly inappropriate given that she was 11 and he was 31. Others suggest that Mrs. Liddell may have misinterpreted the nature of Dodgson's interest in her daughters. Others argue that the break may have been entirely unrelated to Alice herself, perhaps connected to a quarrel between Dodgson and Dean Liddell over college politics. We don't know. The pages are gone. What we do know is that Alice Liddell grew up, married, had children, and lived a long life. She never forgot the story or the man who told it to her. Alice Liddell grew up to be Alice Hargreaves. In 1880, at the age of 28, she married Reginald Hargreaves, a wealthy cricketer and landowner. They had 3 sons. She lived the life of a comfortable English country lady for many decades. Then the First World War arrived. 2 of her 3 sons were killed in the trenches. The war that destroyed a generation destroyed Alice Hargreaves' family as well. Her husband died in 1926. Facing financial difficulties, Alice was compelled to sell the original handwritten manuscript that Carroll had given her, the illustrated copy of Alice's Adventures Underground that he had personally presented to her decades earlier. She sold it in 1928 at Sotheby's for a then-record price of £15,400. It later traveled to America, purchased by a consortium of bibliophiles who, in 1948, presented it as a gift to the British people.
a gesture of gratitude for Britain's role in World War II. It is now held by the British Library, where you can view it online. In 1932, the centenary of Lewis Carroll's birth, Alice Hargreaves traveled to New York to receive an honorary doctorate from Columbia University. She was 80 years old. The photographs from this trip show a small, white-haired woman with bright, direct eyes, something recognizably still there of the child who had once demanded a story on a summer afternoon on the Thames. Alice Hargreaves died on November 16, 1934, at the age of 82. She had outlived Carroll by 36 years. She had lived long enough to see Alice in Wonderland become one of the most beloved books in human history. She had lived long enough to understand, perhaps, the full weight of what happened on that afternoon in a rowing boat in 1862. A man told a little girl a story because she asked him to, and the world was changed. A famous story circulates about Lewis Carroll and Queen Victoria, that the Queen loved Alice in Wonderland so much that she wrote to Carroll asking for a copy of his next book, and received, to her bewilderment, a dense mathematical treatise. This story is almost certainly apocryphal. Carroll himself, in a letter, denied it, though some scholars suspect he was being disingenuous. What is true is that Alice in Wonderland was widely read at all levels of Victorian society, including at court. Queen Victoria was a reader, and there's no reason to doubt that she knew and appreciated the book. But here's the interesting thing. The Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland is, in many ways, a comic portrait of royal excess. She's absurd, arbitrary, terrifyingly powerful, and ultimately toothless. Her constant orders of execution are never actually carried out. Off with their heads! And everyone just gets on with things. Was Carroll satirizing Queen Victoria? Almost certainly not in any direct or deliberate way. Victoria was genuinely beloved by most of her subjects, including, by all accounts, Dodgson. But the Queen of Hearts taps into something real, the anxiety about power that is loud and arbitrary and ultimately meaningless, the authority that cannot be reasoned with. In Wonderland, nobody is actually executed, but that doesn't make the threat less frightening. That's our episode. We've traveled from a summer day on the Thames to the quantum physics laboratory, from a 10-year-old girl in a boat to the British Library, where her gift sits today, behind glass, still bearing the marks of Carroll's careful pen. Alice in Wonderland is not just a children's story. It's a mathematical text, a philosophical puzzle, a Victorian social critique, a self-portrait, a love letter, a mirror. It means something different to everyone who reads it, and that, perhaps, is exactly what Carroll intended. He was a man who loved riddles without answers, puns with double meanings, jokes that worked on 5 levels at once. He lived in a world of rigid certainties, religious, social, academic, and he spent his art life systematically, gleefully, and with complete precision dismantling them. The most logical man imaginable, creating the most illogical world. We're all mad here, says the cat. And perhaps that's the point. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves a good rabbit hole. Until next time, watch out for white rabbits.